Well, welcome everyone. I'm Genevieve Aichele, the Executive Director of New Hampshire Theatre Project, and I'm very, very excited personally about this particular topic. I'm going to let Zac give an introduction and we'll get started. Zac.
Yeah, cool. My name is Zac Little, and I'm a board member at the New Hampshire Theatre Project. And this series, Community Connectors, is actually why I got involved with the theater to begin with. I think that, the various issues that we face as a planet, as a community, as individuals, connecting them with the art that we experience is a really powerful tool for understanding and communication. But I do think you have to reinforce it. I think you can't just assume that those conversations are happening. You have to really actively force people to talk about it with you. And so that's what this is about. But I will say that, understanding the material that this particular discussion is tied to is by no means required. Although, we would definitely encourage you to come check out Women Playing Hamlet when the times that it does successfully is able to be shown, weather permitting. So, just to give you an idea of what the play's about, though, Amy is going to explain a little bit about it. So I'll kick it over to Amy now.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name's Amy Desrosiers. I use she, her pronouns. I am the lead in Women Playing Hamlet, which we were so fortunate to open last weekend. It's a story about, it's really an actor's journey through kind of the difficulties of a character like Hamlet, iconic, well-known, and yet so mysterious. Jessica goes through her journey trying to figure out who Hamlet is and who she is, while simultaneously being told you're too young to play Hamlet and you can't play Hamlet, you're a woman. So basically she's being put in all of these boxes just based on how she appears and walks through the world. Eventually Jessica does find herself and is empowered to break away from those boxes which society has put her in and claim a box that is just rightfully hers. It's a really beautiful story. It's funny. I think there's 4 actors in it, and we play about 24 characters. So it is a romp. It is silly. It's for the people who love Shakespeare and hate Shakespeare. And it's a really, really, really great show. Hope you can join us this next weekend, either virtually or live.
Thank you, Amy. We hope you can join us too. She's pretty wonderful in it. All right, well, just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. I just want to remind our audience members that this is being recorded. So when you put your camera on, if you have a question and join us, that's giving us consent to record you. If you have a problem with it, you can just send us a message. CJ says, we can edit you out if that's what you want. So I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for this series, as well as our main stage programs, our season sponsors, JCM Management Company and Kennebunk Savings Bank, and our production sponsors, Piscataqua Savings Bank and Enterprise Bank, and Jim and Pam Kelly, and our media sponsors, Maine Public Radio. So now I want to get started with our wonderful panelists. We have an amazing group of women here, and I'm very proud to have them with us. I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and just speak a little bit about what these words, equity in the workplace, mean to you. And then we'll get started, talk a little bit more in depth after that. Joan, since Piscataqua Savings is one of our sponsors, we'll give you the honor of being our first panelist to speak. This is Joan Gile, who is president of Piscataqua Savings Bank.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. As Genevieve says, I'm president and CEO of Piscataqua Savings Bank. I have been president and CEO since October 1st, so I'm fairly new in the role. The bank is a single office mutual savings bank in downtown Portsmouth, and we've been here since 1877. There have been I'm the 113th president and the first woman president, and I was actually the first woman vice president of the bank. So this subject matter is near and dear to my heart. And in traditionally male-dominated industry of finance, it's been a hard role, but I've seen a lot of good positive changes over the last 35 years. And I think, you know, it means to me that, you know, we're empowered, we're able to grow and provide services to a variety of customers. And if we don't have a diverse workforce, then we can't do good in our community and support our community that's very diverse. So I think it goes hand in hand.
Wonderful, thank you. Stephanie, we will have you go next if you would. Stephanie is the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Phillips Exeter Academy. Welcome.
Awesome, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be with you all tonight. So I guess some initial thoughts about equity in the workplace is really thinking about its intentionality, that it has to be an intentional process. I think that equity in the workplace requires us understanding that not everyone has the same needs, and it requires us to be responsive to the needs that different people have. I think it also requires us to understand that many of the systems that we come into were not systems that were created for all people. They were not systems that were created for women or for non-binary people. They are not systems that were created for people of color. Many of them were not systems that were related for people who have high financial need. They were not created for immigrants. They were not created for people who are non-Christian. So simply recognizing that and then responding to that in an incredibly intentional way, rather than sort of thinking that it might happen, are all the ways that I think about creating equity in the workplace and the conversations about equity that I hope we're having in our workplaces.
Wonderful. Well, it took 113 presidents to get to Joan, so I guess we've got a lot of growing to do. But I really appreciate what you said about being intentional. I think that's part of what this conversation is about. Excellent. Well, Crystal, our final panelist. Crystal, you have such an amazing title. I want to make sure I get it right. She's with the New Hampshire Women's Foundation, and I know you in many other roles too, but you are the Director of Strategic Communication and Community Support. So what does equity mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Genevieve. And thanks for having me. When I think of equity in the workplace, it's so interesting because at the New Hampshire Women's Foundation, which is a nonprofit that has these legacies of all these other different organizations that have merged in various times over the last couple of decades, there's been a shift from using gender equality to using the word equity. And so we've been talking a lot recently about what that means and how, you know, sometimes those words are used interchangeably these days, but they don't mean the same things. And if they are used intentionally, as Stephanie mentioned, it really expands your view from looking at things as, okay, we assume all things are equal. Now we're just going to give everyone equal opportunity and assume that everyone's going to be able to succeed, when of course that's not the case. Not everyone has the same environment, the same background, the systems and the history that set us up that way. So when you look at equity in the workforce, you know, some of our programs are about getting more women elected, and I think it's a little bit easier to look at that sometimes because you can see who's been elected in various identities. But in business, I think you run into a lot of well, this is a meritocracy here, so everyone has equal opportunity. And so it's a little bit more challenging sometimes to look at the work we still have to do and where we still have to go to reach equity. And it includes a lot of policy changes, a lot of system changes. And of course, you know, we know when people do look at equity within their workforce, their business thrives, the profits go up. I mean, there's so many wonderful benefits to be received, not just the benefit of doing the right thing and welcoming all people and being inclusive and everything. So all of that kicks around in my head when I think of equity in the workplace.
That's a lot. We're New Hampshire Theater Project is working with New Hampshire Businesses for Social Responsibility. And one of the things that has been really eye-opening for me personally is understanding the difference between equity and equality. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. So thinking about equity in the workplace and in your workplace in general, our season theme this year is, are we there yet? So all of our plays and all of our Community Connector series deal with that issue in some way. So when we think about equity, first of all, if you could talk a little bit more about your ideas about the difference between equity and equality. Both of you mentioned that, Crystal and Stephanie. And then also, are we there yet? I personally don't quite think so, but what are some of the steps that we need to take to get there? You mentioned having more women elected to public office. So that's the question I'm going to throw out to you. And maybe, Stephanie, would you like to start off on this one?
Sure.
That's a big one.
It is a big one. I guess I'll start with, and Crystal, jump in. Thinking about the difference between equality and equity. For me, equality, everybody gets the same thing. Equity people get what they need. For me, equity are the systems that we create that produce justice. Equality can be the systems that recreate what we have now. So I think that the distinction is incredibly important. Equity communicates a type of care for people in a way that equality it doesn't put people first in the same way. Now, by no means am I saying that we shouldn't be striving for equality or that we shouldn't be advocates of equality. But to your question of, are we there yet? Equality is one step, like it's one tiny step. I think that we've got so much more to go. And it's important for us to recognize the different steps that we take, but also to recognize that we're not there yet. We have a long way to go. And, I don't think we would be having this panel if we were totally there. Crystal, how do you think about equity and equality?
Well, yeah, I mean, I love the way you phrase that people get what they need with equity. I picture, there's a lot of photos that people share, infographics on equity and equality. And there's one with a fence that I see a lot with, different levels of fence or different levels of steps or, a chain link fence or just no fence at all. And it's liberation. But thinking of equity and equality from a standpoint of, I even think of the research that we do for the Women's Foundation. A lot of times we think about, are we just comparing how women are doing to how men are doing, or are we actually measuring how people are thriving, people of all genders? The title of this is Equity in the Workplace. Are we there yet? I know that gender equity is a big focus with the women in Hamlet, but also looking at racial equity, at socioeconomic equity, and all of the other pieces. We certainly are not there yet. And I've pulled a few data points from some of our recent research. A lot of you will know about Equal Pay Day. And so we pulled the gender wage gap data from recent years, and we're about 81 cents on the dollar nationally for all women versus all men. Again, an imperfect way to measure this. And in New Hampshire, it's roughly the same. And just out of interest, we pulled just people in arts, design, entertainment, and media occupations, knowing that we'd be talking a little bit about theater. And we're doing a little bit better than the national average in that sector, about 86.4 cents on the dollar women get nationally. Oh, sorry, I think I said that backwards. Nationally, in the arts, women are doing better, but in New Hampshire, we are actually falling further behind. In New Hampshire, women in the arts get about 72.6 cents on the dollar, so a little bit less. A lot of these things are, pretty easy to see, and some of them are not. CEOs are still about 70% men. And then if you look at CEOs are 70% men, so there's 30% women CEOs, but women also make about 70% of the salary of CEOs as compared to a man CEO. So it's interesting to look at sort of these equality issues where we're comparing one gender to another, even though we know that gender is not binary. But when looking at issues of equity and what women really need, not only are we not there yet from a measurable equality standpoint, but when we look at what COVID has done specifically to women, and especially women of lower incomes, women of color, women with less education, I mean, the numbers are just really, really drastic. At one point, there was like 3.1 million women had dropped out of the workforce or been pushed out of the workforce. We are still about 1.1 million women down from where we were pre-pandemic. So some of those jobs have been regained, but not all of them. And when we look at essential women in the workforce, I mean, women make up 2/3 of part-time workers, even though they make up about 50% of the workforce. And women are disproportionately more likely to have a job, but not be at work due to childcare obligations, family leave, things like that. So those are all in some way related to policies, but they are also just ways that we see that, massive things in the culture really exacerbate the inequities that are there already. So just thinking about how the small shifts in our day-to-day workplace policies are doing the same thing.
Wow. That's
Mark all
amazing.
the numbers.
Yeah, it's amazing numbers. So I might ask you if you could share those numbers in some way with us, Crystal, and then
Sure,
we
yep.
pass them on to the folks who are listening, because those are very useful things to have. To have at your beck and call. It's particularly interesting to me about the arts. I mean, I know that, but it's kind of hard to actually hear that. I want to get back to this policy piece, because both of you have mentioned that, and I think that's really important. But I also wanted to ask Joan, so you're one of those 30% of the CEOs, the first woman president, first woman vice president. You've really broken that ceiling in a sense of, when we think of a bank president, we don't think of a woman or a person of color, they've just been, I guess I'll just say it, old white men for a long time. But I'm also thinking, I mean, my generation, there were so many things that we just assumed we would not ever be able to do. I have two nieces who are incredible hockey players. And they said, did you play hockey, Aunt Jen? I was like, no, girls never played hockey. We didn't play anything. Now it's the fastest growing sport in the US. So it's really exciting to be on that leading edge. But how did that feel? I mean, do you ever feel like you don't belong, or you haven't made it yet, or?
Yeah, and I have an interesting story for you, and it happens all the time. I go to a lot of conferences, I go to a lot of events, and my husband usually comes with me. My husband was a school teacher for 40 years, always dresses very nicely, very conservative, and we'll be standing around, and he's very outgoing, and we'll chat with anybody. I'm a little bit more reserved, a little bit quieter, and at every single, I can't tell you a time when I haven't been to an event where somebody hasn't come up to him and asked him what he does for the bank. They assume he's the banker and I'm the plus one. And it happens all the time. And that gets very frustrating. I think in New Hampshire, there are 5 women CEOs of banks. So I think in the industry, it's getting a little bit better, but we're definitely not there yet. And to your point about, upbringing, I think back to, I never intended to be president. I didn't set out to be president of the bank. In fact, I told the board I didn't want to be president at one point. It just kind of evolved. So it's been a very interesting process for me to step into this role. Another interesting story. Yeah, I don't know if any of you have heard the story about the car accident where the father and the son were in a car accident. The father dies. The son goes to the hospital, and the surgeon says, "I can't operate on this child. It's my son." And I'm embarrassed to say that my first instinct, well, the son had 2 fathers. And no, the surgeon was the son's mother. But because of my upbringing and growing up in the 60s and 70s, there weren't a lot of women surgeons. So my muscle memory doesn't go there. I have to be very conscious of that bias that I have. And it's not because I don't think women can be great doctors. I have 2 daughters in the medical field, and it's not that I'm, don't think that, but my muscle memory doesn't go there. So I have to be very conscious about thinking, and thinking about women and their roles. And, I was very embarrassed that that was my first instinct, that I didn't think that the woman was the surgeon. But, when we grow up, especially when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, women were stay-at-home moms. And so it's been an interesting process for me to take on this role and to be a working mom and to demonstrate to my daughters that, women can do whatever they want.
Well, I think it's really important what you said, to think about our own biases and how, we struggle. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, so it was even worse. But the one thing I do like to say is in just short generation here, we are making some strides. So there's some hope. We've got it up to, what did you say? 81 cents to $1. So that's not too bad. So I want to come back to some of that individual responsibility, but first I'd like to talk a little more about policy. So I think we'll start with you, Crystal. What are some of the policies that really need to be changed in our systems? You mentioned that as well, Stephanie, the systems. So both within, in individual workplaces, on the governmental level, what are some things that we can help implement and support that will keep working towards equity?
Whew, how much time do we have? There are so many. I mean, of course, being a woman in New Hampshire, my mind immediately goes to a lot of the reproductive choice and access that has been cut off in the last year from our New Hampshire legislature, who implemented a really extreme abortion ban. We know that when women have, and anyone who can become pregnant has options for choosing their own futures and when and whether to become pregnant, education and economic security goes up and earning potential goes up. When we look at policies within businesses, I think COVID is such another interesting talking point as well, because people were able to see behind the curtains a little bit what working families had to go through. It became a little bit more the norm. Hopefully still is the case, but some people are getting yanked back into work full time, but hopefully flexible workplaces have become a little bit more the norm. Policies that need to change in order to encourage more growth for women, both in business and in politics and in the arts, et cetera, have to do with making that environment more attractive to not just the same old people. So whether that's inclusive family policies, whether it's, a breastfeeding station at workplaces for new parents, whether it is flexible remote options, whether it's just changing the culture so that, running to pick up your kids or to care for your aging parents is a little bit more doable. And this sort of hustle culture that we're all under the expectation of gets, put in the background. And really we're looking at, people's work and their contributions and having a full life. Those are just a few policies that come to mind.
And I have, I want to hear Stephanie's ideas on this too, but I'm curious, in the New Hampshire Women's Foundation, do you actually do advocacy work on the governmental level?
Yeah, so I was actually testifying at the state Senate last week on a childcare bill that actually would give more dollar incentives to childcare workers. That's an industry that's really been hard hit. And one of the reasons why is because workers in that industry are paid such a low wage. It wouldn't be a minimum wage in most states. And so there's a lot of particular policies that we have to, it's such an interesting way that the New Hampshire legislature works is that, there's 400 people in the House, there's every single bill gets a hearing. And so we have to really work together in coalition with a lot of other organizations that do advocacy to even figure out which bills are going to see the light of day and make it out of committee. And so our policy director goes through and identifies which bills will have the greatest impact, which bills we should show up and support, which bills we should show up and oppose. There's always a lot going on, but yeah, we do advocacy work as well.
Wonderful. I've been involved just on a very, very small basis with trying to support different bills that are affecting the arts right now. And it's, yeah, you could just do that forever and ever, but.
Yeah. And I have to say, like, sorry to just keep talking, but this is just another point where if we had remote access available for our New Hampshire legislature, both for people testifying, somebody like you who might be very busy and not be able to go, and for the legislatures themselves, then we would be able to accept and enable a lot more people to run for office. A lot of people can't take all this time in the middle of their day to go to those hearings. So that's another policy that could really affect some change in the state.
Well, and that's a great example of a big overarching policy that then affects many, many other things. So that would be something to push for. Great. So Stephanie, what do you think? What are some policies that you think, maybe not so much on the governmental level, but you're in education. So you're in, Ivy League, Phillips, Exeter. So how is that?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, like Crystal said, we could talk about this all day. There really are so many. An article that's been floating around that I found really powerful. I've certainly been challenged by it. Everybody that I've shared it with, I'll share it with this group as well, has been challenged by it. It's about the ways that white supremacy and patriarchy really infiltrate organizations. And it challenges us to think about what seems like the little things, but really make a huge difference in people's lives. So what does it mean for an organization for everything to be surrounded by the agenda and you're not able to deviate from that? What does it mean to value only certain types of knowing that have to be written down, but we're not able to look at other types of knowing, like embodied knowledge? What does it mean for only one person or a couple of people to be the ones who are speaking or to have authority, and everything has to be passed through them? And so these are just the little ways that so many of us grew up learning how to do business, what does it mean to be professional, and who gets counted and coded as professional. These are the things that I am hoping that organizations like my own school at Phillips Exeter, but every organization is starting to examine and is starting to unpack, and then going a step beyond and actually doing something about that. I think the only way that can happen is through having regular equity checks, and that's like unturning every rock. Right? It's looking at every pebble, it's talking to everyone and figuring out what are the things that are not working, that are preventing us from investing in the success of all of our colleagues and our coworkers. So I think that that's one step. It's the actual commitment to doing that equity work. And that's something that can only happen through time and through some talent. It can only happen through time and talent. We can't just anticipate that because we're having a conversation about equity that we're somehow going to go back into our organizations and they're going to be more equitable and inclusive places. And then the other side of that is investing in the people who are doing the work. So one of my favorite authors right now is Adrienne Marie Brown, Emergent Strategy. Absolutely love them. They really talk about investing in the people who are already on the ground doing the work. So if there's somebody in your organization who is already on the ground making affinity groups or employee resource groups, there's somebody in your organization who is working as a board member or as a volunteer with a group outside of your organization, that's a great opportunity to invest in them and to say, what are you learning? Somebody who's going to grad school, who's really focusing on equity work, what are you learning? How can you bring that into the organization? And then how can we compensate you either in time or in money for doing that work? So realizing that this work, the talent is not free, and that in order to really move an organization to a more equitable, inclusive, just place, we got to invest. Women have to invest, and the people who are not women as well in our organizations have to invest in that. It's got to be a real partnership and collaborative effort.
I like that when you said women have to invest. I was just seeing if she was here because I know we had somebody from the Seacoast Women's Giving Circle that had signed up to attend this. And I know that women in equity is their theme this year. And I always think that Women's Giving Circle is such a fabulous example of women working collaboratively. So just great. Okay, something else you said I'm going to come back to, but I want to ask Joan. So what, do you have anyone specifically in the bank that works on this? Do you have a position, or how do you deal with these issues?
We don't at the time, at this time. You know, we only have 40 employees, so we're very small, but equity and inclusion is something that, you know, I've kind of been fostering, you know, in my short tenure at the helm, and something that we're starting to talk about a lot. And I think those conversations are very, very important. You know, we talk a lot about our board and our board of corporators and our customer base. And, you know, I always get the comment back, well, we don't live in a very diverse, you know, neighborhood. You know, Portsmouth is not very diverse. And to me, that's a cop out. It's why don't we have a diverse community? Why don't we have a diverse customer base? Is it not welcoming? Is it not welcoming because our board of directors are, you know, 40-year-old white men? And so people don't feel comfortable. They don't think this is the bank for them. So, you know, it's conversations that we're starting to have and starting to bring to light. We are certified B Corp, so it is a process and something that we're evaluated on to become certified. So, you know, we're starting to put it into our policies. We're starting to, you know, really talk about it when we're doing our hiring. And I was going to make another point, but I can't remember what it was. So it's a conversation that we're really starting to have.
Wonderful, thank you. I think it is hard, you know, for smaller organizations. We just, you know, here we are, New Hampshire Theater Project. We have conversations. That's what we do. We want to talk about difficult things. And we were at a meeting last night. We were reminded that we never did develop a statement on inclusivity for our own organization. So one of the board members is working on that, but it just, you know, we just didn't get around to it. And it's like, it's hard to push yourselves to do that. I love what you said about deviating from the agenda, Stephanie. So I'm going to ask Zach, would you be willing to come back on for a moment? Kennebunk Savings Bank, I know you do a lot of community outreach. Do you have anyone at your bank that specifically deals with these issues?
My friend Liz has the coolest job title that you can have, which is social responsibility manager. And so, you know, that's her job, right? There's also a bunch of other like letters at the beginning, which I still don't understand. I've worked at the bank for like 2 years. I should really know what the letters mean. But the part I pay attention to is, you know, social responsibility manager. And we always try to plug that title as often as we can, because how cool is it that we get to have one? You know, in the case of Kennebunk Savings, it has a lot to do with giving money away. You know, that's a big priority for the bank is doing a lot of investing in local nonprofits. So, I mean, most of what she and her department does is just figure out how to spend that money, which is, it's also, you know, that's why it's not only is it a cool title, it's a cool job. But yeah, there's also a lot of internal committees. You know, there's a diversity committee, there's various employee engagement committees, and those conversations are hard, you know, because they tend to go in circles, right? Like they always, it's so difficult it's really difficult to turn a big boat in any direction, right? And Kennebunk Savings has 330 employees and has locations in 17 communities. So yeah, it's a big ship to kind of steer around. But the trick, I think, and the thing we keep telling ourselves and that our job has to be is we have to keep remembering to keep trying, basically, you know, we have to keep having these meetings and keep trying to turn that wheel a little bit, you know, and I mean, I think we are. I think it's exciting to see where it's going, but it's a big ship and it moves slowly. But, you know, to like overextend this metaphor, when it does, it'll make a bigger wave. Surprise myself with that one. Sometimes I don't know where these sentences are going to end when I start them.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that what Stephanie, you said earlier, that intention, it's having the intention, we can talk about it, but we have to actually do things, do the advocacy work, or create policies in our own organizations. I have a couple of other questions, but I want to just open this up for a minute to the audience if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask. And I'd also, Amy, at some point, I'd love you to come back on, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this 72.6% of a dollar for women in the arts in New Hampshire. you know, Amy's been with our company, what, 2 years, and she's been a real leader in terms of programming and thinking about how we make choices with the plays that we do and everything else. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that. How about equity in the theater?
I think it's all about intention, just like Stephanie was saying. It's really, I mean, white American theater is problematic in so many ways, and it's kind of the way that the theater in this country has been run, and that goes the same for New Hampshire. So really being intentional about programming and making sure that different perspectives are represented, and that we're able to have these conversations out of that and really make an impact in the community. I mean, I personally don't see the point of theater unless it impacts the community. So yeah, that's kind of my takeaway from that. But I mean, I'm not surprised by the lack of funds for women in the arts in the area. I think New Hampshire has a long way to go. I wish that it was a closer number. But yeah, I mean, hopefully I looking around at this virtual room, I feel like there's a lot of incredible potential to drive the state forward in a great direction, which excites me and gives me hope.
Great, thank you. So if there is anyone in the audience that has a question or a comment, we'd love to hear from you. You can just let us know in the chat or raise your hand. But I'm going to pose to our panel. So what about we as individuals? I mean, it's a huge ship, as Zac said. There's so many policies and things that need to be changed. But what do you think are some very specific actions that we could take within our own communities, within our own businesses? What are some next steps? Because sometimes these things become so overwhelming. There's so much to do and so much that needs to be done. Stephanie, you're nodding, so I'll let you go first.
No, I love thinking about this. And I get the privilege of being an equity and inclusion leader at my school. I get to do this for a living. And I'm always thinking about the ways that we can individually move this work forward. I think probably the best piece of advice that I got years ago was that everybody can be their own equity and inclusion leader within their sphere of influence. You don't have to have this as your job title. Like, we all have a sphere of influence, whether it is at home with our children and teaching them how to be equity and inclusion leaders, or it's at our jobs and working within that sphere. Really specifically, things that I think folks can do, and particularly in thinking about women and non-binary people who have historically not had some of the same advantages and are not getting the same coins as people who have those privileges. I think that we can really focus on mentorship and sponsorship. So difference between those, you know, mentorship and really being a place where someone can come, a person where someone can come, where they can seek advice, where we can share resources, where we can share our path, we can listen to their goals, help them along their path. And then that next step of sponsorship, where we're willing to say, I see you, I see what you're trying to do, and I'm going to help you get there. So when I'm in a spot where I can bring you there, where I can say, you know what, I'm going to put my neck out on the line because I think this person would be a really great fit at this job. Like, that's the difference to move to sponsorship. And I think that we can do that for each other. I hate to think of when we get in these roles where we finally have a little bit of power. And it's so exciting to see us on this call because I think that we're here because we have gotten in roles where we do have a little bit of power, a little bit of agency, and we're looking to bring people along. But to get to that place and to sit back and say, I made it, everybody else has to do the same thing that I did, to struggle and climb and make it. I think that's a way that's something that really hinders our equity, and that really figuring out ways to, when we are the ones who can make the rules, to make better systems so that other people don't have to work as hard. You know, I think about Kamala Harris and what her mother told her, you know, you might be the first, but make sure you're not the last. And that's really, really, really important to me as we think about equity.
That's right. I love that quote. Wonderful. I have something else I'm going to ask you, but I'd like to ask Crystal and Joan the same question. What?
I just to piggyback on that, I was on a conference call yesterday with Nancy Lieberman, the basketball player, and she had a great term, and I loved it. She says, you need to lift when you rise. So as women, when we rise into a role, to lift somebody up with us. And I thought that was a great term and a great concept. The other thing too, mentoring, and not mentoring someone who is different from you. So you can learn from them. I think that's very important.
Thank you. Crystal?
Absolutely. That reminds me, it was at the Combahee River Collective that said, lift while you climb. I love that, lifting each other up as you're, you know, making sure that you're not the last one. I was thinking about we unveiled some strategic priorities last year of voice and money and power for the Women's Foundation, knowing that one without the other doesn't come with enough weight to really lift people. And thinking back to Zac's nautical analogy, brought up a story with someone that we were talking with at one of our events about this voice, money, and power, about this new Women and Girls of Color fund that we are starting, recognizing that, you know, only 1.9% of philanthropy goes to women, but way less than even 1% goes to women of color. And, you know, whether or not, Joan, to your example before, like, you know, not taking that cop out of like, oh, New Hampshire is a less diverse state than many states, than most states, but really focusing on who needs lifting the most. And she used this analogy of dropping a pebble in the pool of inequity, that, you know, there's everybody in the pool of inequity and people of all identities in the pool of inequity. But if you have only one pebble, and hopefully you gain more pebbles as you gain more power, but if you only have one pebble, you have to decide where to drop it. And so if you target it at who needs it the most, those ripples are still going to affect everyone. So it's a little bit, you know, it's a little bit of a rising tide lifts all boats, but it's a little bit more targeted than that, because it's really saying that when you focus on who needs resources the most, everyone else is going to benefit from that as well. So that's something that comes to mind.
Wonderful. I like that so much better than the rising tide lifts all boats, which
it's not everyone.
That's sort of what we're talking about, equality as opposed to equity. You know,
right,
it's what you need. So I have a question. When you're talking about mentorship, I think it's sometimes difficult to reach out in some ways, because you don't want to be seen as, oh, you look like you need mentoring, let me help you. So I think that's why there's sometimes a reluctance to reach out, because you don't want to be seen as assuming that you're capable of giving help and someone needs help. Does that make sense? So thoughts about that?
For me, it's taking an interest in someone. You know, it doesn't have to start. It's more of an organic kind of mentorship. I mean, if you show an interest in someone, especially someone that's different from you, take an interest in their life and their family, I think it can happen more organically. And then it's a two-way street. I think mentoring not only helps the mentee, but it helps the mentor just as much.
Absolutely. So that's a great point. Just be interested. Someone heard the other day just said, be curious.
Mm-hmm.
Crystal or Stefan, you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I love the idea of the organic mentor. I also really love the idea of the mentor that is the mentoring structure that could be set up in an organization. And what I mean by that is really creating the space for, you know, colleague to colleague, to be able to talk to one another, to be able to decode things for someone who is new. It's so valuable, particularly those of us who are the first or the one, still the one after many, many years. It's incredibly valuable to have someone who is a little bit farther along the road, who can just point out the pitfalls, who can just point out maybe the places where we're going to need to be a little bit more careful. We might still have to be going on that path, but we're going to need to be a little bit more careful. And having the space carved out within the workday, that's another one of the structural things. So mentoring doesn't all have to happen outside of working hours. But from the very top, I think having the space carved out, even to get a cup of coffee with somebody or a nice beverage like once a month, I think can be helpful. But I also love the organic mentoring. And certainly I hope that many of us have those in our lives, those people who have been mentoring us and that we mentor them.
Yeah, I think I was having trouble at first thinking about that from that perspective, because I think it has happened pretty organically. And I think back to like just being generous with information, like sharing your salary is a huge one. And I think back to when I was freelancing, when folks would come to me with just a small, timid question, I would be like, here's my contract I use, here's my pricing sheet, like just like super generously sharing this information, because, that sort of gatekeeping is what often keeps people out of certain work. So being really upfront and being as transparent as possible, especially with people from other marginalized backgrounds, of like, this is how much you should be charging, like you're not charging enough. And just being really, really generous with information is a way to just sort of set that up. And then the person will come back and know that you're a safe person to ask for other questions.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. I think to a certain extent, we all do this probably organically and don't think about it, but actually being conscious of it, being intentional about it is really important. So once again, I'm just going to open this up. Is there anyone in the audience that has some questions or has anything that you would like to share, ask advice for, need some mentoring on? I think we've probably got a number of people in the audience who are mentors themselves.
Looks like Terry has a question.
Terry, turn your camera on and join us. She's got her hand up. You have to unmute yourself, Terry. We can't unmute you.
The host has stopped me from turning my video on. So anyway, I don't need to have.
If I can hang on 1 second.
No, hang on.
There you go. Okay. See if you can do it now.
Okay.
There you go. Okay.
I've just had an interesting day where I've spent it with teachers and children, and I would just love your optimism and your vision for teachers today who are experiencing so many oppressive legislative acts to control them and how they teach and what they can tell young people. And in our divided society, education seems to be taking a huge hit. And I wonder what you would tell women who are in the classroom, who are maybe feeling a lot of control being placed on them when they have a vision for what they need to teach.
Thank you, Terry. That's a great question. Terry is an amazing author as well as a teacher. So yeah, that's a great question. Anybody on the panel have some thoughts about that? It's agonizing to me what's going on right now.
Very troubling to me. How can we teach children to have respectful conversations with people that are different from them, that may have different ideas from them, if the teacher is limited and in fear of retribution if they allow these conversations to go on? It is very, very troubling.
I know that there's a lot of legislation right now that's potentially going to make it either better or worse. I think my advice for teachers themselves is to reach out and ask a friend who has more time than they do, because teachers do not have enough time to go and testify. Ask some friends to bring their story to the State House, sharing their story in any way that they can, like, hey, will you hop on the phone with me for 15 minutes? I'm just going to tell you what's happening in my classroom. And can you go and share this with legislators? I mean, it takes time to sit and write your representative. So if they can ask, somebody else who has more time to do that work on their behalf, whatever easy way they can find to share their stories. I know that there are a lot of advocates that are really fired up about education funding, education censorship, etc. And they are hungry for stories to share, to, march purposefully to the State House and really use to help change these policies.
I think that's great advice, Crystal, just sharing their stories with the people who do care. And I know that they've also set up with the House, there are so many bills, it is pretty easy now to go in and just vote yes or no for a certain bill. It doesn't take that much time. And sometimes I go in and vote on 7 or 8 of them, and it takes like 5 minutes. So I would definitely advise doing that as well. Stephanie, I saw you taking notes. So how would you answer Terry's question?
Carrie, I thank you so much for that question. Such an important one. I think about 2 things. So one, teachers did not become teachers for the government. Teachers became teachers because we love kids. Right? So I think that always coming back to that is really important, in helping teachers remind themselves of the joy that comes from being in such a special, incredibly special part of a human's life. We get to guide little people in their journey as they learn how to become bigger people who will hopefully not make these laws. The second part, though, that I think about, is just really helping teachers understand the history. I think that while right now there's a lot of talk about education being the source of cultural violence, education has been the site of cultural violence in this country for a long time. So this current issue, as we're talking about, we want to teach kids, we want to have Martin Luther King Day off, right? But we can't teach kids why we had Martin Luther King Day off. As we are in this current moment, recognizing this moment has happened again and again and again. And so we will get through this one too, right? We will get through this one too. And the way we get through it is with teachers, I think, who remind themselves of that joy in the classroom. I get to, work with teachers every single day, and part of the work at Phillips Exeter isn't just the high schoolers that are on the campus. We're a boarding school community. So our faculty, our staff at school have teachers that are in SAU 16, which is, right at the ground zero of so much of this conversation that's been happening in the state. And just as others have said here, using the entire community to get involved and to say we support our teachers, so important, so incredibly important. And how lucky for you that you got to spend a day with them.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was a wonderful answer, because I think it's so easy to forget why we do what we do and why we love what we love, when we're fighting what seems to be a battle. As a friend of mine who's a little bit older than I am said, I have been fighting the battle for women's reproductive rights my entire life. Why do I have to get out on the streets yet again? It's hard, but we just have to keep moving forward. I see a question here. Oh, it's just thank you. Really appreciate your sharing your experiences and guidance. Thank you, Drew. So we have 5 minutes here. Does anyone else from the audience have a question? You just need to raise your hand, and then I can invite you to turn on your camera. But while we're looking for that, I'm going to ask the panelists. I'd like to end this with one round of, what did we forget to talk about? What haven't we discussed yet? And what are our next steps from here? if you could invite this group that's here tonight, and I'm assuming there's going to be many more people who will actually watch the recording, what would you invite them to do next to work on this idea of equity? So I don't see any other questions. So, Joan, do you have a thought? What would you invite our listeners to do?
Keep challenging, keep pushing the envelope, keep challenging the people around you.
Which it gets risky sometimes, because it's hard for us to come out of that emotional shell. And what was it? One of you said, it's the things we don't talk about, our salaries. You know, we don't talk about money. We don't share those things. And there's still some discomfort around issues like that. So it's challenging yourself as well as challenging your organization. And is there anything, Joan, you feel that we haven't talked about that needs to be talked about?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, no.
Okay, we've run the gamut here.
Yeah.
So Crystal, what haven't we talked about, and what would you like us to take away from this?
Yeah, I think one thing that I didn't mention that I would want to make sure to clarify for folks is that that 81 cents on the dollar that I mentioned earlier, again, that's for all women. And when you look at different races, it's very, very different. So Equal Pay Day is celebrated April 12th. That's the date most women would have had to have worked to from the previous year in order to make the same wage as a man. But Black women's Equal Pay Day is much later in the year, as is Hispanic women's Equal Pay Day and Native American women's Equal Pay Day. So I would encourage folks to look those up. In terms of where we go from here in actions, one of my favorite calls to action that feels really doable in a really overwhelming time is from Beth Pickens, who's an artist consultant out of LA, who wrote a book called Your Art Will Save Your Life, which she wrote right after the 2016 election to help encourage artists to stay artists and not leave their jobs to become lawyers if that wasn't really what they wanted to do because the world was on fire. And she said, pick one thing that affects you. So something that you have personal knowledge of and can use your personal story and information to help other people in your whatever that marginalized area that is. And then pick one thing that affects somebody more marginalized than you in whatever way that is. And those are your two things. And just do as much as you can on those two things, or pick one skill that you have. Like, I'm the person that brings all the speakers to the rallies, or I'm the person that offers a place to stay for people. Like, either pick an issue that affects you and someone else, or a specific skill that you can do for all the things that you care about. And those are two ways that you can, focus a little bit, because everything seems so overwhelming.
I like that. One for you and one for somebody who needs some help, that lifting up. I think for artists too, COVID, for many of us, it's hit us hard in a lot of different ways. So that's exciting to think about. Thank you. Stephanie? You get the last word here.
Oh my goodness. I think Crystal should have had that last word. I'm just reflecting. I really love that. So to echo a bit of what Crystal shared, intersectionality is something that we haven't talked about yet. And something that I think that we absolutely need to talk about whenever we're having a conversation about equity. And really what I mean by that is that marginalization doesn't just occur on one sphere. Marginalization can occur on multiple spheres, whether we're talking about people of color, we're talking about low-income people, immigrants, religious minorities, any of our categories of social identity, intersectionality, particularly when folks are in marginalized groups, that those marginalized groups can actually amplify the feelings of oppression and the material reality of oppression. So something that would love to keep in the conversation about equity. In terms of a takeaway, oh my gosh, being an activist is hard work. In addition to doing the hard work, it's also important to know when to pass the baton, when to pass the mic. It's important to know when to find joy, as we were talking about before. it's important to hold ourselves accountable to these things as well. So when we find that we are not making the progress that we want, when we find that someone else is actually who's doing the same thing, who's moving right along, but they've got more energy to do it right then how can we let go of some of our power, pass the mic along to them, and to help them fly as well. And then we can get it back when we're ready and they're weary. But remembering that we're all in this together.
That's beautifully put. Thank you. If you have any more information about the idea of intersectionality, because I have to admit, I didn't quite follow what you were saying there. And we're out of time, but if you have any suggestions for people that would like to know more, you can pass it on. That would be great. Well, we are at 6:31 and I don't want to take up any more time with anyone, although I think we could probably talk about this forever. So thank you all. Thank you, Joan, Crystal, Stephanie, for joining us. Thanks to Zac and Amy, and for everybody who listened. This was just a very powerful conversation. I hope that we can continue it. Zac, would you like the last word as the host?
I would just do my duty as a board member and direct people to check out the On Stage Now section of the New Hampshire Theatre Project's website. Look and see the shows that are coming up, and be thinking about like the conversations we could be having based on those next couple of plays, because that's what we're doing too.
That's right. Thank you. And we do eventually all of the Community Connector series will be up on our YouTube channel as well. So you can check all of them out. Thank you very, very much. Thanks for everybody who joined us tonight. And I like what you said about hanging on to our joy. Let's do that in the midst of all this craziness. So thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.